my fourth stuff, but
All right. Well, hey, welcome to Beyond Sunday School, putting the New Testament in its place. This week, we are looking at reading the New Testament as theology. And as always, you may hear some voices as we are recording, and those are folks who are live in the Zoom room with me. And they get to ask questions and be involved in a little more of the dialogue with me. But as we're rolling here tonight, being live on Facebook, would love to have your comments and thoughts as we get rolling. The Facebook feed is a skosh behind our live feed, so I will do my best to try to catch comments as they come in and get them up on the screen. But this, and then the recording of this will be available on YouTube. It'll be available as a podcast as well. You can find Beyond Sunday School anywhere that you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, all those places, and would love to have you check that out if the live video thing is not your kind of deal. So glad that you are with us this evening as we dive into reading the New Testament as theology. The book that we are working our way off of is called The New Testament in Its World by N.T. Wright and Michael Bird. It's a really good textbook as a New Testament theology, as a kind of an introduction to the New Testament, and so we're using that as our jumping off and as our guide. And you can grab that on Amazon. It's not super cheap, but the book itself is, I think, pretty accessible. So it'll challenge you for sure, but it will also I think be something that's helpful to you. So all of that to say, let me pray and we will get going here. Heavenly Father, thanks for tonight. Thank you for your scriptures and for a community of people that allows us to dive in together. I pray that this information might help us go a little bit deeper as we study the scriptures so that we might be changed. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Well, hey, over the last couple of weeks, we have looked at the introduction, a little bit of an introduction to the New Testament. We've talked a little bit about the New Testament as history. Last week, we talked about the New Testament as literature. Both of those are available in the podcast or on my YouTube channel for you to rewatch, or right here on Facebook. You can scroll back and find that live video, I'm sure. And you can catch up there if you'd like. But tonight, we are talking about New Testament as theology. And that is because as we read the New Testament, we have all three of those horizons working together: history, literature, and theology. And in some ways, New Testament as theology is kind of the way that most of us think about the New Testament. Oftentimes, we think about the New Testament only in terms of theology. And, the hard part is when we do that, we tend to kind of begin to shape it in our own image. We tend to kind of make it look the way we want it to look, and we start, basically kind of reflecting ourselves back into it as opposed to being changed by it. So, why don't we get rolling and take a look here at where we are heading this week. So, kind of the first question that we have, some thoughts that we need to think through, that we need to wrestle through, is what does it mean to read the New Testament as theology. What does it mean to actually do this? Well, first, we read the New Testament from a historical point of view, right? We have to understand it that way. We have to understand that it's placed, that it's a text that was written at a specific time in a specific place to a specific people. We have to understand that the authors who have written this, have intent. We have to understand that we are interacting with these authors through the text. All of those things are important, and we have to grasp this idea of the New Testament being rooted in history. So that's the first thing, that as we start reading the New Testament as theology, what does it mean to do this? Well, it means to understand the New Testament from a historical point of view. Second, what we're trying to do is we want to try to identify its major theological ideas and bring them into a coherent whole. All right? So what does that mean? Well, that means that, as we read through the New Testament, as we read through the various books of the New Testament, the Gospels, the Epistles, the Apocalypse, right? Revelation. As we work our way through these things, we are going to find that that each author has kind of their own theological foci. What? All right, I've got a teacher on here. Joanne, what is the plural of focus? Is it foci? Focuses? What? How do we pluralize that?
I don't know that there is a plural. I've never, some words that are the same in singular and plural, so I don't know, but Janet's looking it up.
There you go. Perfect. So these guys have these, they have these theological ideas that they're working on, that they are trying to bring to the fore. And so as they do, we want to identify those, but then we want to move kind of from this, individual level or atomized level, right, at the per book level, and then we want to bring it out into a coherent whole. How does Matthew's theological focus or theological emphases align with Mark's and Luke's and John's? How does Paul impact those things? How does Peter impact those things? How does John impact? How do all of these books now come together and make some sort of a coherent whole? So that's kind of what it means to do this. That's what we're kind of working on as we think through what it means to read the New Testament as theology. And as we do, then we have some questions that we need to wrestle with. First, should we focus on historical description or theological content? Or another way you could say that is, do we focus on historical description or theological prescription? Right? Because remember, history, as we understand, the historical content, all it does is describe. It's telling us something about a time. It's telling us something about a moment. So as we seek to understand the history, as we seek to understand the social setting, as we seek to understand the cultural setting, the religious setting, those things are descriptive. Theology is prescriptive. So it's trying to help us change. It's shaping us. It's moving us. It's challenging us. It's transforming us. And so, what are we doing as we come to the New Testament? Are we giving our focus to historical description, or are we giving our focus to theological content? And the answer is yes. It's yes. We have to do both, right? We have to get our minds around the historical description so that we can then dive deep into the theological prescription. We have to do both. If we try to pull the two things apart, if we try to just focus on the history, then we're missing a huge part about what the New Testament is, right? Because the New Testament is a theological work. Now, if we try to do the theology separated from and disconnected from the history, then the theology becomes nothing more than kind of cultural moments, these little things that aren't all that meaningful. They're not timeless. They're not truly going to help us grow and change. So we have to try to hold on to both. Another question that we have to wrestle with: is Jesus part of New Testament theology, or is he simply the background? Right? There are some scholars that argue that Jesus is not part of New Testament theology, that the New Testament writers were not doing any kind of theological work about the person of Jesus, particularly the gospel writers. Their argument is that Jesus is simply the presupposition. Jesus is just there in the background, kind of always present. He's kind of the shoulders upon which things are built. And I'm not sure I buy that argument, right? I think Jesus, it's a both. I think again here, it's a both and. Jesus is the underlying narrative that's kind of right there in the context of the New Testament. We can't pull Jesus apart from the New Testament writings. It's also the place where we get our history about Jesus. It's where we learn about Jesus. And so in some sense, he is the presupposition, but there's also theology being done about the person, work, and identity of Jesus as the Christ, right? As Jesus as the Messiah, the one who is making things whole, the one who is setting things to rights. So it's this both and. All right. Third question. Do we handle each document individually, collectively, or chronologically? So, can we just pull each one out and just kind of do it on its own? Or do we need to handle the documents only in the context of this greater whole? Or do we need to spend time trying to understand the New Testament in its chronological order? So that means that, instead of maybe giving some primacy to the Gospels, maybe we give, our primary focus or attention or weight to Paul's letters, right? Because they were written before the Gospels. So how do you do this? Well, I think again, it's kind of a both and, right? It's all of it together. We work with them individually, but we also have to place them collectively in the context of the whole. We also have to be aware of where they fall chronologically, right? So, when you sit down and you read Paul's epistles and you read the Gospel of Luke in the book of Acts next to those, guess what you begin to see? You begin to see a lot of connection. There are a lot of what we might call echoes of Paul in Luke's writing. Why? Well, because Luke traveled with Paul, right? He was a part of Paul's traveling band of disciples. And so it would make sense that we would see overlap between Paul and in the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. Now, we see the same thing with the writing in Peter and the Gospel of Mark. We see this kind of overlap. We see these echoes. We see these connections being made. Why? Because Peter and Mark were probably close. Our tradition tells us that Mark was Peter's scribe, that he worked closely with Peter. So we begin to see these emphases that will begin to kind of cross over in these different texts, and we understand that only as we understand them individually, collectively, and chronologically, knowing where the different pieces of literature that make up the New Testament fit in the chronology. All right. Next question. How do we find unity in the diversity? This is one of the big ones. This is a big question, and we're not going to answer this question tonight, but it's an important one, because as we walk through these texts, as we work our way through the New Testament, as we are studying it and trying to take it seriously and trying to place it historically, and we're working through these things, we're going to find that there is diversity of thought, right? I mean, this is why James, the letter of James, and Paul's letters are oftentimes seen as being in conflict with one another, right? They challenge one another a little bit. They seem to rub up against each other. There's some diversity there. Why? Because James has a different emphasis than Paul, and yet the heart of the theology isn't any different. We have to do that work. So the easy thing to do is, when we see some of the diversity of emphases, theological focus, all right, Janet, did you find the plural of focus?
Yes, you were right. Foci.
Foci. All right. That's a good word. I'm using that
Never-
word. So they each have their different theological foci, and they're going to bump up against each other at times. So we can either do what some did, which was to say, well, James just must not be authoritative. It shouldn't be a part of the New Testament. You just kick it and ignore it, right? Or you do the work and you try to figure it out, and you work your way through it. And sometimes we come to the end and say, I don't know, right? It's okay at times to punt, right? On third down, it's okay. It's okay at times to say, I know that it is. I don't know why it is, and come to that place. And then a final question is there a canon within the canon? And so what that means is there stuff in the New Testament that is more important than other stuff. And we see this developed whether we want to admit it or not. This is where each of us, either individually or within our own streams of Christianity, take different foci of theology and bring them to the fore and say, these are the most important things. These other things are not most important. So these things that we deem as most important, well, they're canon. They become a canon within the canon. And we all do this. And so as we are working our way through, what we need to be doing is trying to identify that. We want to try to identify when and how we are creating this canon within a canon, and ask ourselves, is that right? Should we be doing that? Do we need to de-emphasize some things and create greater emphasis in other things so that we can have a more full understanding of what is happening in the New Testament? So those are questions that we need to wrestle with. But we also need to try to define some terms, right? And so when we are talking about reading the New Testament as theology, oftentimes what we're talking about is biblical theology or doing biblical theology. Now, it's different than doing theology biblically, all right? These are technical terms. So hopefully all theology, whether you're doing biblical theology or systematic theology, hopefully it's all biblical, right? Hopefully we are understanding the New Testament as authoritative, as the text that is going to drive our theology. I had a seminary professor who was teaching us systematic theology, but at the beginning of the class, he said, you guys need to understand, every person that we meet is a theologian, because every person that we meet has ideas and thoughts about theos, has ideas and thoughts about God. And so we're all theologians. The question is, will we be good theologians or bad theologians? And so there's these two main streams of how to do theology. And as we read the New Testament as theology, what we're kind of looking at doing is biblical theology. And so that's defined this way. This is the task of determining the theology of the biblical witness as expressed in the Scriptures. We begin with the Scriptures and work our way toward theology. So oftentimes the way this works is you would sit down with the Gospel of John and you would read it, you would study it, you would identify his theological emphases, right? His theological foci. You'd be like, okay, what does John have to say about redemption? What does John have to say about grace? What does John have to say about salvation? What does John have to say about God? What does John have to say about Christology? And you kind of work your way through only looking at what does John have to say about these things. But you let John develop those things. So John might not, he might not have any teaching on angelology, right? And he might not have, there are going to be places, aspects, theological categories that a particular biblical writer might not touch on. And you let the biblical writer determine the theological categories that writer is speaking into. And so you're starting with the text, and the text then is driving you towards theology, and you kind of work your way through every single book that way, or every single author that way. Now, systematic theology or dogmatic theology is the other way around. This is where the categorization of theological witness, this is the categorization of the theological witness that we see in the Bible. So we begin with the theological statements and work our way back in the Bible. So we start with these ideas, right? We start with Christology and say, okay, what does the Bible now have to say about that? And so you're going to proof text Christology or the Trinity or redemption, whatever theological categories you're working through. You're going to kind of go through and you're going to find all of the references and all of the verses that speak to that. And then you're going to develop a concept, a theological concept out of those verses. So, a good example here of what systematic theology would be is like something like the Westminster Confession of Faith, right? That's an example of systematic or dogmatic theology. There are a lot of books out there that are called systematic theologies, and that's what they do. You walk through every single, you walk through these key theological categories or concepts or principles and see how does the whole Bible speak to these things. And so really, truly, to do systematic theology, you need to have done biblical theology. They both kind of work together. But I would say that biblical theology is more foundational. And out of it then, That's where we should begin developing our systematic theology. If we go the other way around, if we start with systematic theology and kind of kick biblical theology to the side, then we are very much in danger of creating theologies in our own image, and that's problematic. So there are some really good systematic theologies that are out there, but what's really interesting about them is when you read a systematic theology, it doesn't feel all that timeless, because it's asking and answering questions from the particular day and age that it was written in. So one of my favorite systematic theologies is written by a man named Louis Berkhoff, and when he wrote that in the late 50s, I mean his conversation partner, like the foil that he was arguing against, that he was engaging with, were Lutheran theologians. So he goes after Lutherans throughout his systematic theology. It's really interesting, but it feels very anachronistic now, right? When you read through that and you're like, what's the problem with, like, why is this guy going so in on Lutherans? Like, what? That's strange. It doesn't feel timeless. Another one of my favorite systematic theologies was written by a guy named Michael Horton. And he wrote a fantastic systematic theology, and you can tell when you read it, he's trying to make it more timeless. His engagement, his conversation partners are the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, and so he's kind of trying to engage on this bigger stream, but it's still, soon enough it's gonna feel anachronistic again in 50 years, because the conversation is going to change, which is why we constantly have systematic theologies rolling out. But you go back and you read a good biblical theology, and it feels very timeless. It feels more fresh, more evergreen, so to speak. And so those are kind of the two ways of thinking about theology. So now the next question in this is, why pursue New Testament theology? Why do it? Well, first, the authority of the New Testament for the church is rooted in its theology, right? So we don't look at the New Testament authoritatively because it's a good history book. We don't look at it authoritatively because it's got a lot of neat facts about Jesus, right? Like that's not what's going on there. We look at it authoritatively because of its theology, because it is teaching us and shaping our view of who God is, of who we are, of what's going on. Now, even as I say that, we have to recognize the reality that the ultimate authority is rooted in God, right? Jesus at the Great Commission, which is kind of my consistent benediction, right? He doesn't say all authority in heaven and on earth is given in the text. He doesn't say all authority in heaven and on earth is given in the New Testament. He says all authority in heaven and on earth is given to me. So the authority is rooted in Jesus, but Jesus' authority operates through the New Testament as it is the witness to the person of Jesus. So the New Testament is pointing us to who Jesus is, and it's witnessing to who he is and to his life and ministry and all of that. And so that's how Jesus' authority comes to us, is through the text. This text is our only clear, consistent way to access the life of Jesus. Yes, we can pray, but prayer is different than what is happening when we sit down and read the New Testament. So practically, it is the theology of the New Testament that has shaped the identity of the church and its witness to the world. Right? So, I mean, that just seems to kind of stand on its own, I think. That, you know, when we open up the New Testament, we want to try to figure out what we as the church are supposed to be doing, who we are supposed to be, what is our mission. It's when we open up the New Testament, and that's kind of how it's been. We have been, like we talked about in the history thing, and when we talked about in reading the New Testament as literature, we are a people of the book. And so, you know, it's just partially a practical thing as well. So there's this great quote that I think summarizes this pretty well from Wright and Bird. They say, to put it simply, New Testament theology is necessary to describe what it is about the New Testament that is authoritative, and to define the activism that should characterize the church as participant in God's plan, namely the intention to sum up in the Messiah all things in heaven and on earth. That's a bit of a mouthful, but what they're getting at is what we is kind of this idea of what we just talked about, that we have to do this New Testament theology, and we have to put the work in, because the New Testament is authoritative for the church, and it defines how we are to live in the world, how we are to engage the world, how we play our role in God's plan. Right? This is some big stuff, and this is why just kind of trying to take the New Testament and using it however we want and kind of flipping through it however we want is just not going to work. So we have to do New Testament theology. We have to put that work in. So if we're going to put the work in, what is our approach, right? How are we going to do this? What are the things that we need to be working on? Well, first, we must give space to historical context and theological content, right? We are required to do justice to both and seek out their fusion. We have to pull together history and theology. We have to tie them together. And so Wright and Bird put it this way. They say, if we take seriously the contingent historical nature of the New Testament, its back then-ness, the fact that while it was written for us, but was not written to us, then we will recognize the essential need to situate the New Testament in its social, religious, and historical context. That's a big idea there, right? The New Testament was written for us, but not to us. I've heard it said that every time we read the New Testament, we are reading somebody else's mail. I just think that is such a great thing. Now, as we read through the New Testament, we do get the sense that these guys knew that they were writing for posterity, that they knew they were writing for people beyond their original audience. But that doesn't mean that it was written to us. These things were still written to a specific people in a specific time in a specific place for a specific purpose. And so there's this reality of these texts being historically connected and rooted. And so we have to do that work so that we can keep that in perspective, that the New Testament was written for us and not to us. So the biblical writings, when read or studied or brought into communal life, inevitably bring theological construction and raise questions of application. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is, as we read the New Testament, like if we're gonna take the New Testament seriously, if we're gonna read it as theology, if we're gonna read it with this sense of it being somewhat authoritative, then what is going to happen is our view of God, our understanding of our faith is going to be shaped. It is going to be developed. It is going to be constructed, which then raises questions of applications. How do I take this text and apply it to my life? How do I bring it into my everyday? And that's that's good, but it's hard work, and it demands us to spend some time in all of these various things, right? To develop our theology, we must consider it and think about it in the context of history, literature, and theology, fusing the two things. Marcus Bachmuel, he's a theologian. He said this: "At the end of the day, when everything is said and done about the genetic vagaries of the New Testament canon's formation." So what does that mean before we go on? Genetic vagaries, he's basically kind of saying, okay, so how the New Testament was written, exactly who it was written, how they wrote it down, and how it was exactly formed. While we have some sense of it, it's still vague. So even when everything is said and done about the vagaries, the vagueness of New Testament formation, it remains an equally historical phenomenon that the Church Catholic, so the Church Universal, came to recognize in these 27 books the normative attestation of its apostolic rule of faith. Right? I mean, this basically what he's getting at here is he's saying, don't miss how big of a deal it is that you have this faith that is, by and large, with very few outliers, over the last however many thousands of years, couple thousand of years, have said that these 27 books are it. They are the things that shape us, that orient us, that help build us into people of faith. Like that is a really, really big deal. And we can't see that as being a big deal if we pull the theology away from it. So we have to understand the New Testament as being a document that is shaping our identities as followers of Jesus. So as we continue wrestling through what is our approach, what we're trying to get at is an accurate description of the world behind the text for the purpose of shaping our world in front of the text, right? So what's the world behind the text? That's the history. What's our world in front of the text? It's our theological understanding of what's going on there. So history is descriptive, theology is prescriptive. So we're doing both of those things. So then the next thing that we want to try to understand is that the beliefs and stories found in the New Testament for the Christian are not simply historical relics, right? They point to what the Christian is to believe and the task they are called into. So, the reality is that too many people can swing too far to the history side, and so they see these things just as historical relics. They're just, oh, that's nice. That's a nice fact. But that's not what it's meant for the one who is seeking to follow Christ. If we are seeking to follow Christ, then the New Testament is something deeper. It's something more. It points to what we are to believe, and it points us to the tasks that we are called to do. It's how we live. What are our lives supposed to look like? I'm reading right now a book called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. And, You go back and you read these early Christian, these early Christians, the early church fathers and mothers, and what they talk about is not the beliefs. They talk about the changed life. It's so fascinating. It's so fascinating. In the early catechisms, right? It usually took around 3 years before they would baptize someone in the early church. And so during that 3 years, the issue wasn't even learning theology. It was being taught the New Testament and having lives changed. That was the test. Did their lives change? Have their habits changed? How they live out in the world, these people who want to come and take the body and blood of Christ, who want to come and be a part of this communion table, have their lives changed? And so we only get to that place if we understand the New Testament as a theological book that shapes our identity and shapes our view of who God is and how we are supposed to live. So if it is this theological work, then what it does is it is answering worldview questions. It is answering some key questions that shape our identity and shape who we are. And the worldview questions are simple. Who are we? Who are we? Where are we? Where are we in history? Where are we in culture? Where are we in relation to the person, life, and work of Jesus and God in this world? What time is it, right? Where do we fall in salvation history? Where do we fall in the story of humanity? What time is it? What's wrong? Everybody knows there's something wrong with the world. Anyone who doesn't think there's nothing wrong with the world is living in denial. So what's wrong? A worldview answers that question. And a good worldview is going to give you a solution. What might the solution be for this thing that has gone wrong? The New Testament helps us answer that, right? And then what should we be doing about it? If there's an answer, what should we be doing? What is our role to play? How do we go about moving through this world in light of who we are, where we are, what time is it, what's wrong, and what the solution might be? So another way to think about this is to think about the New Testament as the first scene of the final act of God's narrative, right? So we have the whole Bible, and you can think of the whole Bible as this big play, right? This big narrative that God has pushed us into, has got things going. And so, you've got the act of creation. You've got the act of the fall of humanity. You've got the act of Israel. You've got the act of Jesus. And then you have the New Testament, the first scene of the final act. And we today, here we sit in 2021, which, how weird does that sound? Sounds like, a sci-fi movie. But here we are living today as the people who are now trying to write out the final scenes of this five act play. And so the New Testament gives us our trajectory. The New Testament points us in the direction that we are going to go as we are developing and as we are living it out. Tom Wright and Michael Bird in their book kind of close this section this way. They say, theology instructs us in how to use the New Testament as the script for the people of God, who perform their role in the gospel-shaped ensemble that is the local church, in which God has put them. Theology, in other words, enables us to use the New Testament as the basic script for the mission and life of the people of God. The local church, the global church, and every member within them. So, if this is what theology does, it helps us write the script. It helps us figure it all out. It helps us perform our role in the gospel song. So let's do a case study together briefly. Let's take a look here at a passage in Scripture that for us to rightly understand, we need to kind of have these things fused together. We need to understand history and everything else that's going on. So let's take a look here. Galatians 2, verses 11 through 14. And it goes like this. It says, when Cephas, another word there is Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles, because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in front of them all, you are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? So that's some conflict in the early church. And if we don't understand the history, the social, the cultural, the theological stuff, then we're going to miss out on what's going on here. We're going to miss out on the full weight. So let me ask you guys some questions for your feedback. Why do you think Paul was upset in Galatians 2, 11 through 14?
Because Peter was being a hypocrite?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because Peter was being a hypocrite. And so what do you think? So with Peter being a hypocrite, what do you think he was doing wrong?
He was living one way when he was with Jews and another way when he was living with Gentiles.
Mm-hmm. So what does that mean?
Say that again. What?
What does that mean? What does it mean that he was living one way when he was with Jews and one way when he was with Gentiles? What does it mean that he was that he pulled back from the way he was living?
He wasn't confident in his own beliefs.
Okay. All right.
To me, I wonder if he even believed what he said he believed.
Okay. And what do you think he believed? Or at least what did he say he believed?
I need the Bible in front of me.
Okay, we got
to look at it in front of us.
Yeah.
Well, he wanted to
All
be
right,
like
my friend Jeremy, he says, going with the crowd
2, 11 to 14.
is what was going on there. He says, go with the crowd. Yeah,
What?
so there's definitely some frustration there. I think that's part of it was this go with the crowd aspect. What else? What else do you think Peter was?
He was trying to please everybody instead of standing up for what was right.
right.
Okay.
Right.
All right. And what was right?
Including everybody.
Okay. Yep, including everybody. So what do you think was what do you think Paul's theological idea that he was communicating here in Galatians chapter 2 verses 11 through 14?
Does this have something to do with the Jews thought that circumcision was really important and that was a big deal? But then what Paul was saying was it's not the circumcision, the actual act of circumcision that changes you. It's the thing of the heart.
Okay.
And just because Gentiles weren't circumcised didn't mean that they couldn't be a part of the body of Christ.
Okay. Yeah, we're getting closer, right? So what is, when you think about, what do you know about table fellowship from that time?
You mean eating together?
Yeah.
Well, that was one of the big ways that they fellowshiped, right? They ate together.
Yep.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So part of it was fellowship, but there's even more, right? So, when my buddy Jeremy said, maybe Paul's theological idea here that he's pointing out is that he wants to meet people where they are at, and so that's probably part of it. But what's really interesting is, when you would sit down to eat with somebody, this is a symbol of not just fellowship, but family, like a deep connection. This was you saying, hey, we're one, we're a part of the same body. And so as you go back and you read into some of the Old Testament passages, you find out that the Jewish people were instructed to not have table fellowship with non-Jewish people. Like they weren't supposed to share a table, because they needed to keep themselves separate. In Acts chapter 10, you have the story of Peter and Cornelius, right? And in there, Peter even says, you God-fearers know that me as a Jewish person should not have, I should not eat with you. And so as you have this, you kind of have this thing happen where, Peter, before the guys from James show up, is doing what? He's sitting at the table. He's eating with the Gentiles. He's saying, we're one. We're a body. We're a family. We are tight knit. This is, you are my brothers. You are my sisters. But then the people from James, what Paul calls the, how does he put it? He calls them the circumcision party. What does Peter do? He won't eat with the Gentiles anymore. Do you see what's happening here? Peter is basically saying, well, yeah, you're kind of my family. You're kind of with me. Oh, but now I gotta do this thing over here. And so what Paul sees in Peter is he sees what Peter's doing as going to the very heart of the gospel, right? Because what the gospel is supposed to be doing is unifying it all. It's setting all things right. It's bringing everyone together, which is why Paul, says later on, right? He says, in Christ, there is neither Jew nor Gentile. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female. It is this uniting thing that Christ has done. And so we can, if we don't have, so this is why we have to do this New Testament theology stuff, right? Because we we have to see in this little story, not just an argument between Peter and Paul, not just Peter's hypocrisy, which is there, not just Barnabas's hypocrisy, which is there, but the theological work, the theological work that we do in this is understanding what Paul is calling us to. He's calling us to this life and action of being with people, of taking down the barriers between people, uniting people, right? And it's this is that redemptive work of God. And so when Peter says, no, I'm not eating with the Gentiles, in effect, what he is saying is, no, they're not saved. No, they're not part of the people of God. No, I will not eat with them at the table. Which, I mean, that goes to the heart of the gospel. That Paul cannot stand for. So do you see how as we begin to grapple with theology, as we begin to grapple with the history, as we begin to grapple with all these different layers, it brings, like, there's so much happening here in the text that can help us and shape us and give us direction, right? Because now this raises all kinds of application questions, right? How do we deal with people who are acting hypocritically, or how do we practice table fellowship? Who can we invite in? How do we tear down the dividing walls between the different people in the world today? How do we go about taking those steps? And those are big, hard questions that we're seeing played out all over the world, right? We're seeing that played out throughout our culture, throughout our society. And so as we work our way through that, this text now can be helpful to us. And we can extend it out, right, and continue reading into Galatians to get more. And if Paul just fleshes it out, this is why in chapter 3, verse 1, he writes, "You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Before your very eyes, Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed as crucified. I would like to learn just one thing from you. Did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law, or by believing what you heard? Are you so foolish? After beginning by means of the Spirit, are you now trying to finish by means of the flesh?" I mean, he's going all in because of what Peter has done. And he's just going to continue to develop this. So I want to wrap. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mhm.
Very much.
Cool. So I want to wrap this up with one last quote from Wright and Bird. They say this: "Rooted in history, we are shaped by theology, not least the theological claim that God will put all things right at last. As our lives affect real transformation in real history, today and tomorrow, and on until God himself, in the ultimate act of creative sovereignty, does for the whole creation what he did for Jesus when he raised him from the dead." This is the very work of theology, is that it is shaping us to have a real transformative effect in real history, today, tomorrow. And when you have bad theology, man, we see that. We see the negative effects of bad theology, right? We see how it gets sideways, and how we lose the plot, right? You can look at like a Westboro Baptist church, for instance, and the evil and the hatred that they spew out into the world. Why? Because they've been shaped by bad theology. They've taken these texts wrongly. They've divorced them from their historical, social, cultural place. They're not doing the work, right? They've found their enemies and they're reading back into the text what they want it to be. And so it's a reflection of who they are, as opposed to being shaped and changed by the authority of Jesus that is in the text itself. So this is what we want to do as we read the New Testament as theology. We want to be shaped and changed and transformed by it. So, do you have, as we kind of come here to the end of this week's installment, do you have any lingering questions or thoughts or reflections from tonight?
No.
Kind of let it soak in.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
And you know that Peter is having problems because he's facing tradition. And he's going to try to win over the Jews. But that was a bad situation right there to try to win them over. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because there are times when we want to win somebody over that we may change the tradition a little bit. You know, not that we do something wrong, but I kind of feel sorry for Peter in a way because he's trying to make everybody happy, which you can't do, you know.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Well, and it's so hard because the people who came from James, who Paul calls the circumcision party there in Galatians 2, were other Christians. They were other people who were following Christ, and Peter was afraid of them. And you know, fear can be a powerful motivator to make us act in ways that maybe we don't want to act, right? So yeah. And the other thing that's so interesting, Dorothy, is, here's Paul, right? I mean, he's the guy who wrote, to the Jews I become a Jew, to the Gentiles I become a Gentile.
Right, exactly. I was thinking about that. Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I become all things to all people so that we might save some, right? So
right,
I mean, this
exactly.
So it's and so I think that's the other interesting thing is understanding in that context, in that Galatians 2, that he's talking about Christian to Christian and what's happening there, because there's a different thing happening in Christian to Christian, where Paul's like, no, you need to maintain your integrity and challenge those Christians that now have wrong theology, that are missing what's happening here. So we've got some work to do. I think a lot of us, I know me in particular, I've got things I need to continue working on and figuring out. Because man, I don't think any of us want to become like Westboro in those kinds of places.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Well, hey, let me wrap up the live stream. For those of you watching this after or listening to this after, would love to invite you to come be a part of the Zoom classroom where you can talk and engage with me as we go through an evening, and we chit chat after for a little bit as well. So would invite you to be a part of that. You can just message me and I will make sure to get you that connection info. It's good every week. Now, just a heads up, we are going to be taking the next 2 weeks off. So we'll be back in 2 weeks. And as we come back, we are going to be looking at the person of Jesus and spending some time focusing on him and his work. So until then, love well, my friends.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
sir.
Dan.
Hey, you're welcome, ladies. Yeah, so next week,